Cook, and I'm the Vice President of Instruction here at the college, and I want to welcome you all and thank you for spending a sunny afternoon inside. I think it will be a fantastic presentation. I think you'll really enjoy it. So let me tell you a little bit about Faculty Speaker Series, and I'll introduce our speaker. Actually, I'll introduce our student who's going to introduce our speaker, and we'll get on with this. Since 2008, the Faculty Speaker Series has showcased distinctive Clark College faculty members sharing their work beyond the classroom. Work may include sabbatical or dissertation research, field work, the results of community outreach. Each quarter during the academic year, this series features the experiences that have enriched the lives and teaching of faculty members, and as a result, the lives of our students in our community. Through the Faculty Speaker Series, Clark College aims to address some of today's most intriguing issues and to join the college community in learning through our own faculty's wide range of interests and achievements. Our Teaching and Learning Center is very proud to host this event through the generous support of community members who contribute to the Clark College Foundation. So I want to take a moment, I want to thank Michelle Bagley, the Dean of Library, e-learning, tutoring, faculty development, who helps sponsor this, and Lorraine Leedy back at the camera, who really makes this work happen. Thank you both for that work. I don't believe there's anyone from the foundation here, but we could not do this without foundation support. Community members have given money to the foundation to support this effort. We really appreciate that. We really appreciate the foundation making this a reality as well. So, Heather McAfee joined the Geography Department of Clark College in 2012, holds a degree from Pikes Peak Community College in Colorado Springs, along with a Master of Arts in Geography from the University of Oregon, Bachelor's in Political Science from the University of Colorado. Serves on the board of American Association of Geographers Community College Affinity Group, and is a volunteer with the Immigration and Refugee Community Organization in Portland. She considers herself a global citizen. She's seen most of the U.S. by car, having driven from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. She's lived in Europe and worked in the Middle East. Her research and life learning have led to dozens of countries around the world. Heather calls herself a cultural feminist geographer. Her emphasis is on migration studies. Central to her current research is Iraqis' resettlement in American cities such as Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas. She explores how Iraqi refugees reconstruct their concepts of home following the displacement caused by the March 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. And I also want to make one other announcement. Heather, as of Friday, was selected as our only sole tenure track geography instructor, so she'll be heading our geography department. So, with that, there's some other things in here. Teaching, Heather tries to get students excited about unpacking the why of where and how they see themselves into the world. She brings her own living and travel experiences into discussions in order to personalize her students' understanding of foreign locales. She says she tries to push boundaries while creating a safe space for learning geographic concepts. And so at this time, I want to welcome Heidi Mason up, one of Heather's students, to formally introduce Heather.
My name is Heidi Mason. That was Heather McAfee's class in geography last quarter. She's always been so excited. The first day I ever met her, I was getting ready to, I was 2 weeks into the quarter and I had no clue of what classes I was going to take, and I needed an extra class, and she allowed me in her class. And at the time I had no clue what geography was about, let alone how to even say it. It's hard to say. She's just so eager and just so happy to teach you about geography and all the aspects in it. It made me to where I was just completely excited about going to her class. I even brought my 17-year-old son in her class so he could see what geography was about. And from that, she also got him excited about college, and today I registered him today. She's just a magnificent person, and from her energy in geography, it made me to where I was eager about it, and I applied that to my own studies and realized that geography also ties into women's studies as well as political science. So from her eagerness, I've changed my degree of studies, and I'm very, very honored to introduce Heather.
Thank you. I'm so excited. I feel really loud. I don't normally need a microphone. I'm all over the place and quite loud, so sometimes it'll get excited. I feel a little bit like Madonna right now. So what I wanted to do when I first had Anne say, you should do this faculty series, you've been all over the place, you have so many ideas. What I wanted to do was, what research projects should I introduce to you? And I realized that at the same time, I also wanted to bring geography to you and make it accessible. And we have, geographers have a wonderful way of living. We live at multiple scales and we have a language of our own, and sometimes it's quite problematic for others. I notice immediately where people sit in a room. Everybody feels from the back forward. The forward is kind of scary. I promise I don't spit too much. But it is that spatial interaction that we have. And I don't think it's odd. But some people have highlighted, especially my best friend, how I participate in the world a little bit differently. For example, a story that my best friend tells from time and time again is that I really meant it when I wanted to drive from the East Coast to the West Coast when I was moving out here. And that doesn't seem odd, coming from Yorktown to Virginia to Eugene, Oregon. But I didn't really understand the big deal. He actually says all the time that there is a little bit of a deal when someone does this. So we're going to actually use the tools of geography. We're going to pop out here to Google Earth. And we're going to play the fact that I lived in Virginia here. I did a little tour for you. Lived in Virginia and my home there. And we're going to just take a little tour. Let's hope the simulation plays for us because this is that tour. Within the space, close about 2.5 miles from Yorktown, I drove out of my driveway and headed east. Now, it took him a few moments to understand what I was doing because he did say, Heather, we're driving to the West Coast, correct? And I said, yes, I need to go to Yorktown first. I took a picture, and then we meandered across the United States to Eugene. And coming back to this story in a minute, I will tell you that I made him get back in the car after we unpacked the vehicle and head to the coast after an exhausted week-long trip so that I could stand on the West Coast. And then I was done. It lasted about 15 minutes. I was tired. I said, let's go back to Eugene. Really? It's like a 50-minute drive. So when we think we're going to go from one place to another, we really mean it. Let's go back here. And pop into this one. All right. So last month, at the American Association of Geographers meeting in LA, I picked up one of the news articles, and it said to us that geography threats geography and social science funding, especially the community college level. Being on the affinity group and looking that we struggle in the social sciences to teach people where we are located in the world and how to use our discipline in a way that shapes critical thinking. I began to wonder, how do I actually shape this talk to make it accessible for students that come and visit, for my faculty members, my colleagues, and help us move past these kinds of issues threatens us from K through 12. So I kind of taken this opportunity to get to preach to the choir a little bit and celebrate not only my community here at Clark, but also the opportunity to push us forward and push our boundaries so that all of you can teach geography in your classrooms, just so one person doesn't stand alone here. Back to that story. This is the picture I took. I did literally just get out of my car for about 2 seconds, snapped the shot of Yorktown. I didn't want to drive fully to the coast. This was as close as I could get. And then on the way back, obviously a not so happy best friend in Florence, I took another picture of it. For me, I grew up in Colorado, in the mountains, no coast. For me, that is spatially a way to interact with my environment and landscape. Those two pictures might seem quite normal to you. That's your environment if you grew up here. It wasn't my environment. I really meant it when I said I'd like to drive coast to coast. My poor best friend. Now I share this because even I chuckle at myself in my randomness. I highlight the different scales when we're in the classroom. I highlight the different ways we operate our lives and the language that we use. I want people to think that in a typical space, driving from coast to coast would mean going from Virginia to Oregon. That is coast to coast. You're just stepping back at a national scale. When you're in that space of Eugene and you start grad school and you think, I'm never going to drive that 50 minutes. I'm going to be immersed in learning about geography and expanding my mind. I won't go that extra 50 minutes. I rarely drove the 2.5 miles out of my critical distance to Yorktown's beach. And I lived there for 3 years. So that is the challenge. We can operate on typical scales and we can move through as everyday lives, but for some reason as a geographer, as identifying as a geographer, where my home is, how I interact spatially, is accessible to all of you. And it's exciting to me. And I want to put that out there for us to think about. So just in case you're wondering, you might also be a geographer. I've put a few bullet points up here for us. In a typical conversation, you would use words like spatial. Yes, I spelled that correctly, because I get called all the time on this one. Boundaries. In other words, you're getting a little too close to me, we need to renegotiate our boundaries. Border. I'm not talking about the snow sport kind. That often happens, we add an A there. Landscape. And we're not just standing out in our front yard this time of year looking at landscape and saying, we need to go to Home Depot. Your passport photo does mean more than any other photo snapshot because they're traveling on the road and they look at you and say, this doesn't look like you. I promise you, I took 4 this year. And I just looked at them. My roommate's here, she looked at this, all 4 of them, and thought, this just doesn't look like me. I kept going. You find yourself geeked out by, most maps. And I have a few maps in my presentation for you today. So hopefully you'll feel it too. You argue more with your GPS car receiver than your partner. That was a big clue. No, I promise you I am going in the right direction. And of course, no one's convincing you to give up your window seat on the airplane. I don't care how big their brown eyes are at 3 years old. You're not going to give it up. Okay, maybe. And then when you come home from trips, you have way too many photos like this. From the window seat. Or this from the window seat. And this from the window seat. And I know that I have a lot of pictures of the wing in there too, so you can tell my motor vehicle. Okay, so enough about being a geographer now that you're thinking about this. I'm going to bring you into a little bit of my research. I traveled when I was 18 years old to Europe. I took my college money for funding at a 4-year college, and I put on a backpack, and I decided that I wanted to go see the world. But I didn't know who I was. And that really didn't happen until a few years ago, where I could identify with something and be excited about it. And Tim kind of listed my identity off in the introduction. And I know that I'm comfortable in those shoes. I know that when somebody says she's a geographer, I'm fully present and I'm ready to actually get you excited about it. What I didn't really know how to unpack things that bothered me and that I saw in the world. I needed the tools, and I found that not through political science, not through a human train analyst within Iraq and the Department of Defense, but I found that at U of O. I found the language to express that. I love the Middle East. I'm not an expert by any means. I don't think anybody can be an expert at really anything that fast and that amazing. I do my best to speak with refugees and speak within a space of the Middle East. And it bothers me, the different levels that I haven't been exposed to yet, but I know that I have a lot of lifetime to go out there and reach it and access it. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot, a sliver of the pie right now of that research. And I'm not going to admit that I know everything, and nor can I say that this sliver, is anywhere finished. It has to be talked about more, and I'm pretty passionate about My first exposure is, and these are my research interests, and it kind of came up. I am focusing on the migration studies for you today and looking at the refugee work. But please, I know that we're all very complex. So don't discount the fact that I look at marginal spaces of power and gendered spaces. This is where Heidi gets really excited, because you can go into women's and gender studies and political science, and you can look at the space that we're operating in. All you have to do is ask that location. And I'll bring her up again and embarrass her a little bit, because she had such a brilliant discussion on Facebook that just exploded my heart and broke it at the same time. I looked at those spaces of legal and interaction of legal and behavioral geography, and I like political landscape, violent landscapes, because it really gets to the nitty-gritty of more than a battlefield. We embody those battlefields. Now, my first exposure to fleeing refugees was when I did live in northern Italy in the late 1990s during the Kosovo conflict. I volunteered with the International Red Cross, and I'm going to read a little bit of this because this is a very emotional part for me, and I journaled this section of my life, and I like to use this in a passage here. I volunteered with the International Red Cross while fleeing Albanian Serbs and others made it across the Adriatic Sea. I began observing how crying children and scared families found themselves in the hands of Italian volunteers who referred to them as, quote, dirty, even after they bathed. And as a young woman, I was confused and questioned. This language was problematic for me, as I felt something was being lost in my broken translation of Italian. I went to one of my mentor volunteers. Nothing was being lost. Quietly, a woman in the IRO shared with me my first few articles on race, gendered, and other spaces. This changed my life. In 2008, I was a civilian contractor in Iraq, working with the DoD on a program called the Human Terrain System. The woman here, shown with her head covered up in black, was assigned to me as my interpreter. We called them Turks. She worked as a translator for the coalition forces for about 4 years. She lost her children. She lost her place to live. She moved to the base. She lost access to her family. She provided me with as much, amazing support as possible. But in that suffering, I started to question what she would do. And you want to know what to do. She said, I helped free her home from long sufferings, and that's why she came to work for coalition forces. It just made sense. She spoke English. She had a college degree. And the liberation of her country was very important to her. I came home wondering what to do. You can sponsor your Turks. They ask you to sponsor them to come back. Would she leave her 4 children behind? Would she fight to bring them? The process at that point, I had no idea how long it would be. But she remained in Iraq for about 4.5 years before the last time I heard from her was an email that said, I'm going to Syria. Now you can see at this moment why I watch the news pretty regularly. We'll get into that. My work took me all over Baghdad, all over spaces and places of people who were working with coalition forces. And I began to question where these individuals would be if they weren't living on the FOBs, the forward operating bases. Where would they be? Where would they return to or go to? Where would they find home if their country does not stop the civil war and these targeted kidnappings and violent actions against them just because they were associated with or working for coalition forces? And I began to draw on those ideas, and I formulated some questions. And I went back to grad school so I could start to answer those. The situation is, obviously in the years following the 2003 invasion, Iraq has estimated 2 million displaced persons. Those are internal and external. We can see in this image from UNHCR, in most of those displacements, they fled, they internally mixed within their country, so got numbers that are estimated here, and externally displaced to neighboring countries. I wondered why Syria and Jordan and Egypt, why they're the ones, and Lebanon are taking the bulk of this displaced when they're not having much to do with the fighting. And people get mixed in, if you work with refugees and resettlement, they get mixed in to also issues at home. And now we can see why Syria is so problematic for me. With at this point 1.2 million Iraqis displaced to Syria for assistance. Where are they now? When we think of the why of where, and look at research, what is happening in Syria now, and where are these Iraqis now? Where are we now? Because we're kind of a decade on in a war that's no longer. So I followed that, brought that back home with me, and I apologize, this cut off a little bit from my Mac, and I looked at research on resettlement. And I looked from this time frame up to 2011, and we're seeing referrals to the U.S. for refugee acceptance, referrals to the U.S. And just from 2007, notice this is post-2003, 2007, we had 12,000 referrals from the Refugee Settlement Agency of the United Nations to enter the U.S., but admitted barely 16 million. 2007, how long were we at war in this country? How long at this point? 5 years. And so, again, problematic for me. And I used geography to start answering these questions. They're big. This is a big thing. But when I began to sit down in front of my advisors and start to ask about how do you pick apart that only by 2011, 60,000 Iraqis are entering the U.S. via, admitted via legal means. How do we pick apart that? How do we start answering questions as geographers instead of just crunching numbers and not seeing the faces on the page? And we could do that in migration studies, but I wanted to look at more. I wanted to go deeper into that. So I started asking about home. This is a relatively new concept within geography, and it looks at those spaces of where we call home and how we identify with home, and what's complicated with that. So my study on home, that was my entry point, and it made sense to me. I've lived all over. I've been displaced. When I left my husband in Italy, I didn't have a home to go to. I came back to the U.S. and lived in my car for a few weeks. I was that single person, divorcee, on the fringe of a one paycheck. I was trying to get into college and couldn't afford CU, so I went to a community college. I felt that kind of displacement, and I didn't know a concept of home, so home was my entry point as a geographer. And that's where I'll bring you in today. It's a way of understanding the complexity of specifically post-2003 Iraqi refugees who are settled in the United States. And I'm going to refer to that. It's interesting because we flatten all refugees in the U.S. context. When we study refugees, we flatten them. We look at refugees as a word and not as those individual stories. But in Portland, Oregon, that's problematic because we take in more refugees than anywhere else in the United States. We in Portland, Oregon, have more volunteers with the International Immigrant, with IRCO, the Immigrant Community Refugee Organization, than any other refugee agency. It's exciting and it's overwhelming. And I looked at a group that I wanted to identify without flattening, but also not completely grouping, so I found myself in a little bit of a dichotomy here. I called them U.S. combat zone refugees, and I started looking at research on Vietnamese. And from 1973 until 1995, we opened up our borders in the United States to 700,000 Vietnamese that we displaced directly or indirectly. And another 200,000 followed through social networking. again, by 2011, barely 60,000 Iraqis have been admitted to the United States. I just keep wondering how they will make home. So we have home within a space, especially down the street with Vietnamese restaurants and people that are in our lives that have mixed within a safe space after their home country was in chaos. I looked at those that are directly displaced by the military campaign, but we know that civil war went on there. We know that it's targeting. We know it's more complex than that. As I raised questions about this diaspora, I looked at their acculturation at the local level. And I wanted to choose some cities in that that may be similar, but not the typical Middle Eastern cities that people go to. And so it took me a little time to look at where I should study within the U.S. context. And I wanted also to not just do a thesis or a dissertation project that reported this. I actually was willing to put my job from the DoD on the line and ask the ethical questions about our responsibility in this. And it was really interesting to weigh that over with your security clearance on the line. But I wanted to know about the refugees that we create during and in the aftermath of our ongoing proxy wars on terror. So those are my methodologies. That's pretty easy. I did go and volunteer with the Immigrant Refugee Organization in Portland and with Caritas of Austin. I've spent those two cities. I'll tell you a little bit about my cities because as a geographer, we like to tell you about our cities. And I did that on purpose to have access to their resettlement process. But within my research projects, I look at home as individuals who've been here more than 6 months because I don't want them still in the refugee support system. I don't want any kind of conflict of issue. I want to have them off the system. So I set 6 months on that because most start having a job and are off that integrated system by that point. On average, my refugee participants were here in more than a year in both places. And I looked at a little bit of the framework, and I wanted to definitely stand next to my feminist ideas. And if we look at those feminist ideas and ideology as a feminist geographer, I wanted to make sure that I was ready to work with my participants and not tell a story about them. And I know that that is a very subtle thing for many people, but it actually really mattered to me. And so as the conversation started taking shape, you will see I went to a space of identity and concept of home and then found a sense of belonging. And that came out at the very end. And we'll go there. I wanted to also respect that, like myself from Iraq, who suffered from the effects of PTSD, I knew they were affected by this. And I was concerned, obviously, in my research project about PTSD. But I found that more and more time spent with my participants, they thanked me to be able to tell their stories and to be able to deal with some emotion with someone who'd been there but didn't necessarily carry a gun. And I think that that was important for my access and my positionality within the project. I give you a little bit of direction of literature that I went to, and I really like Stuart Hall. Of course, we celebrate geographers within geography. I didn't limit myself to geographers who looked at this. It would have been hard because concepts of home is a shaping field. And so it went all over the social science fields. But I like the idea of Stuart Hall, and I found this very early on, that identity as a, he goes on, of course you can read this, but in culture projects, identity as a production is never complete. It's always in process and always constituted within and not outside representation. And that's something I could relate to. We are always formulating our identity as we grow. And I know that if we feel at home somewhere, if we feel in a location and we bring meaning to a space and it becomes place, that place is our home, we relate to that. It's part of us. And I know at this point I begin to realize it has to include a sense of belonging. And that has got to do with place attachment. So if you're a refugee and you're displaced and you have no attachment to one place that's accessible anymore, your identity is also constantly being reproduced and in flux. He goes on, and I find I've highlighted some of those. But I love the point becoming as well as of being in both the future and the past. And so we have these things, going back to Benedict Anderson, of imagined communities. We live in the past. We romanticize the past. And I think particularly for someone from Iraq who lived under sanctions, who's had constant war, who's lost somebody to an Iran situation, who's been targeted constantly by government or neighbors, or had moments of just living. I think those imagined communities, those romanticized idea of Iraq, it's difficult to find that sometimes. It's difficult to tease that out as you ask somebody about their home in Iraq. And was it someplace they wanted to go back to? What do they go back to? Is that complicated by this idea that it would be liberated into a new democratic space, and they would be in a position and they would bring to that new democratic space their identity of being in that liberating force. But refugees can't go back. At least not at this moment. They can't. So now it's all about location. All about this idea of locationality. And I went a little bit further and I started looking at identity and meaning of place, and that led me, of course, like I said, to home. And I like Shelley Mallett's idea of home brings together memory and longing, and the idea of, and basically the idea of the temporal and physical spatial ideas of what that is at a local and global level. And the details of this go both positively and negatively in perceptions of home. I drew on some guiding questions that I wanted to bring to you because I think in research it changed. I mean, most people who've done some of these projects, they know that their questions grow and change. And moving from doing something with a group of individuals instead of just about them, my questions did grow. I started off with something that I didn't want to differ from very far in this research project. If home is a place or places, space or spaces, feelings, practices, and or active state of being in the world, then I could ask these questions about post-2003 Iraqis living in the United States. I could ask these questions because they're living within the border of the U.S., a country who liberated a place where they can never return to. And now we start seeing that complication of why home matters here. You make home in a place where people, you're aligned with their political ideas, you've got on board with their occupation of your country, so that you can't actually go and live in that country. And I feel it tells a little bit different story, but it doesn't. Because we have Afghans and still Vietnamese, and we have Kosovo's, and possibly Syrians, new wave of Syrians in this diaspora. They could probably also relate to these, and the list goes on in our worlds. Quickly, these two cities. I think it's fun to say that they're non-traditional gateways, and that's what migration geographers refer to, not the traditional places like Detroit or New York, where you would go to for a Middle East community, right? They are also our two weird cities on the planet. Why they're weird? Well, Portland and Austin, not just because they have a river running through them. There's a sense of political ideology, freedom, progressiveness in these locations. And so I wanted to understand how someone living at home in these spaces felt at home if they had a little more freedom in those locations. I also have a comparison a little bit here of what those cities look like. So relative size in the MSA, size, in Austin, almost 2 million in population, Portland, including Vancouver, a little bit more than 2 million. So we could see similar features along those data sets. Also have, I think I'd like to point out, the 1.5-hour drive to Fort Hood. So did they have ties to military installation? Were they being sponsored? Are these individuals keeping ties with military? Because we know in many communities, the Vietnamese, there was a maintaining of ties for people they worked with. 2 hours here to Fort Lewis, obviously McCord Lewis in Washington. And then we see Caritas is not the only operating institution within Austin. Just ERCO dominates Portland. So I really just had to have data set from one group, and they were really supportive for data collection. But Caritas is one of a number. And so I did also talk to Refugee Services of Texas and other spaces to make sure that my numbers were on board. And it was problematic. There was confusion about how many Iraqi families were there and where they were settling. And then there's movement. They would come into Dallas and then drive down and be closer. So some of that data set was interesting. But by average, by 2010, there's about as many living in both places. You can see about approximately 3,500 Iraqis in both places. And I'm going to give you a few examples quickly, just to kind of see where I took from some of my interviews. And Fatah is, he is in Austin, Texas. Obviously names are protected. He did work in the public space, so his public sector, so he was very okay with being open and part of my study, and continues to be. Bachelor's degree, worked as a mechanic under the sanctions. We've got some skilled work here. This was not unusual for my study. Most people had some sort of degree. Bachelor's or higher. But if you look at some of these concepts of home, I draw your attention to I have a truck, an apartment, and home in Austin, Texas. That's an interesting one. I really want to point this one out to you as I go off on it a little bit. I'm tired with the way I'm asked if I speak Spanish in Texas. That was interesting. Don't Americans understand that other people around the globe look different? But Mexicans even do it. They start talking to me then. I guess obviously this is directly translated. I guess realize that I don't understand. Does this happen in Oregon? And so he says, I don't know, you do studies in Oregon, but do people come up to, your Iraqis in Oregon and ask them if they speak Spanish? And I thought that was very interesting. It started coming out, the idea of home and being at home and working with people, and then a sense of belonging. And so now there's a complication. They're good with refugees here. Maybe not so much Texas, but Austin, yes. So a different scale. Now, not necessarily Texas, but in specifically the town of Austin, yes. I'm still Iraqi, not American, but yes, I would say, how would you say it? I'm Austinian. And he'd say, Austian. He'd always say Austian. But please note, up there, I came to the U.S. as a refugee and had ties to Killeen, had traveled over Texas, up to Dallas, to Killeen areas, and was really comfortable to call Austin his home. He liked the city. And that was locational. It really did matter about location, even though it became problematic over and over in his interviews about being confused as another marginal group. Nadia is here. Her name has changed as well, also in the public. She was part of the Jim Lomasson tour here. It was just a piece of artwork that traveled around. And Nadia also, BA, highly educated. Again, not unusual to be in this space. She says, Portland is not like Seattle, it's my home. My family has our community here. Using those language and words. We miss Iraq. I'm Iraqi, but that place is no longer my home. And so some of these interviews started helping me understand, okay, why did you move from Portland? Why these areas? Why is this coming out in language about home and location? And again, when I go in there, it was very simple to get to the next step. And she opened up and said, Portland's very, not like Seattle, more diverse. I know my family belongs here. We love our church and community, but here, like living in Iraq, we are still different, So it's interesting because you go a little bit further into that, and there's a Christian Iraqi living in Portland who sees herself very colored, who people constantly ask her, do you speak English? So a little bit different moment in different spaces, both progressive and large cities. You can tell I had a lot of information to kind of tease out over a 2.5-year project. A lot of things that were all over the board about spaces and ideas about home and identity. And I was overwhelmed. But I found, pointing out to you a little bit here, I found that for the refugee participants, there are details about displacement. It's important to understand concepts of home in the U.S., specifically in their host country that displaced them. It was complicated by the reality that they were politically and philosophically aligned with us, in agreement with the invasion of their home country. But they were renegotiating identity and home along with a sense of belonging throughout the resettlement process, like normal, like typical refugees are, but surprisingly more than they had expected themselves. They were looking at nationality, differences in education, not accepted for their levels of education, race, their religion, their ethnicity, sexuality. We included within that space 2 members who came out of the closet while in Austin. And looking at that, more ideas about belonging came to me. So I guess this is where we're at, kind of in this place of how do I speak for all this information as a geographer? How do I contribute to the sense of home and identity? And then how do I make that accessible to you, to the refugees I'm working with, to the refugee agencies? How do I do this and not have a dissertation project that goes on for another book in a lifetime, right? And I said, what did we leave behind when I left Iraq? I left closing fobs that looked like this, abandoned spaces that were coming to a close for the next few years. And that category of U.S. combat zone refugees that are going to be in my home. And I realized, in essence, they feel they had to endeavor more to remake themselves visible, worthy to belong, an identity in their new host country, in a country that both liberated and displaced them. We see Iraq as this: a landscape of garbage and violence. This is constantly what the army wants to clean up or rebuild or fix around every corner. This is a typical view of a street in Baghdad. They see Iraq as this: a home that they're hoping still will be rebuilt. That they look for headlines in the paper to this day, having conversations about their home. They believe will be liberated. They don't see themselves as refugees. They see themselves as in a moment of pause from a homeland that's going to be okay. Many of them. They see a sense of belonging on a global level. They just want a community right now. And that's what was really refreshing to me. In the end of it, I realized that there was this one quote that stood out later on. It was called The Importance of Belonging, and it was in a PTSD article that I was reading on psychology and displacement. And it says, we are all longing to go home to some place we have never been. A place half remembered and half envisioned. We can only catch a glimpse of this from time to time. Community. Somewhere there are people to whom we can speak without having the words to catch in our throats. Somewhere where a circle of hands will open to receive us. Eyes will light up as we enter. Voices will circle. As voices will celebrate us with wherever we can come into our own power. Community means strength that joins our strength to do the work that needs to be done. Arms will hold when we falter. A circle of healing, a circle of friends, some place where we can be free. And what was very interesting is after I read this, 2 months later, 2 of my 50 participants had sent me the same article. 2 of them out of 50. 2 people felt that same sense of belonging and said to me, don't stop this job. It's not over. We don't know who we are and where we fit in. We do worry about being in the United States, but we don't blame you. But we'll be at home here. We'll find a place at home here. Would you help us get just a little more of the story out? And that's really, in summary, kind of what happens at that thesis dissertation level. You're kind of left with really no answers. So what I do is I bring it into my classroom. And that's why I titled the talk to you here today, kind of a why and where. How do I tell these stories in a way that it's accessible to you and I don't feel like this isn't going to get published or this isn't going anywhere? And the decade moves on. How do I live as a geographer, research as a geographer, but also teach geography? And that's what I get excited about. Then it doesn't become too much of a story that's not told. When we draw on the board, I have my students mind map. Sometimes it takes a little extra courage to get up out of their seat to come up to the front. If there's a whiteboard, yeah, I'll be mind mapping right now. When we think about culture and identity in the classroom, and I transition, I can't stand in my classroom and tell them the story of what I told you. Because it's a lot at a lower division level. It's hard to do even at the level 400 and 500 levels to get geographers, new burgeoning geographers, to pick apart that answer to the refugee situation when there's no answer to the refugee situation. We're displaced on this planet. We constantly are moving. We're constantly losing home. We're constantly redefining our identity. But when I ask them about culture and start having an individual link that culture or a sense of place or identity, even on the board, you start to see church, community, army, comes out, ego, pride. The same ideas come out. So now I can bring in a little bit of culture and ask, what do you think about a group of people living in your community? What do you think about these articles that we're going to start to pick apart about culture? What do you think about displacement? I walk in and ask them, everybody right now, y'all are going to take out of your wallets your identification. No ID today. You're going to hand it to me and you get to leave. And I said to Heidi, what do you do with your identification? What are you going to do? And she said, I think you said, I can't check any books out of the library. How am I going to pay for school? You can't even show your ID. Like you can't even go and buy a book here at the bookstore without your ID. When we look at those things, now it becomes accessible. Okay, write up there for me. Tell me how you would operate for 1 week without any passport, without any address. At this particular moment in the United States, Eugene, Oregon is the only place that you can pick a street corner intersection and put it on an ID, and that can be your home. Because it's one of the only spaces at the local level in our immediate space that location can be your home if you're homeless, if you don't have a typical home. Or 4th of Main, that's my home. I ask students to look around the world and not just memorize place names and capitals. I ask them to look at maps about stereotypes. It's true. How do we see the world? It is something that's problematic for me to know that one of my students may be walking down Times Square, and Jalen or she'll ask them where Iraq is on the map, and I hope to cross my fingers that they remember. But it's more problematic for me if they couldn't break some of these things down and ask why this is on the board. Why are these stereotypes? Why is this the world as we know it? We should challenge those. We should challenge them in all of our classrooms, in our daily lives with our children. We should break those sense of identity into many pieces and question them. If you're teaching in your classroom or you're talking about something that a student's going to read, put up a map. Bring them there. Again, Heidi, but really proud of her, she said to me, On Facebook, there was this letter I read, and it was from prison, you know? Just like, MLK wrote it from prison. It's a much different situation when you think about him writing this inside a space lacking freedom. So did Antonio Gramsci. And we base most of our theory in political science on prison letters, notebooks of prison letters. How we think about somebody who was not only dropped at the age of 4 and physically was different, and not capable of fighting a war that his brothers went to talks on Marxism and wrote about freedoms and liberation from a very closed space. And then years later, can we compare that? Can we just see a picture and say, how do you feel inside the bars versus outside the bars? If we want our students to understand their place in the world, show them the world. And so as I wrap it up the here and now, I say in our lower division classes, I say this is an opportunity. It's fine if Texas cuts the budget for geography in the high schools. That's fine, because I don't care if you can tell me the state names and their capitals in alphabetical order, backward and forward. It's fine. Get in your car and drive around the United States. But what you can do is take a few slides, photos, and location of places, or bring your kids to those locations when you're looking at Google Earth, a free app on your laptop at home. You can think spatially. I know my belly's sticking out a little bit there, and I do look like I just got overwhelmed by the rush of water that just went in my face at Victoria Falls. But who cares? Look at the falls. It's a great picture of slumping and basically erosion and water and a physical geographic space of rifting within a continent that's coming apart. How cool. Have students map on their smartphones. Have them pull it out. They're texting anyway. Get them to have an app on there. Go look for that information. Have them use those things. Think about space and place. Think about how culture interacts with our physical human environment interaction. Think how they come together. Everything has a location when we bring meaning to it, and space becomes that place. Even for refugees in Portland, Oregon, or Austin, Texas. Those weird cities are not so weird to them. They're probably becoming home now, years out. The classroom is that place to create community that we're talking about in Star High. Community and a sense of belonging to ignite curiosity. I just get a really cool discipline to do that. I get a really cool discipline to push people's boundaries. And I don't think literature or history or mathematics even is any different. Everything has location. And everything can create a sense of home and belonging. And so, guess what my talk was here today and my research is all of that moved me up to where I am right now. In my new sense of home, in my new place, which is here at Clark. That's about what I have for you. If you have any questions, I have a few minutes. I think I got underneath the 5 o'clock mark. Any clarifications? Okay. Didn't put you on the spot. Thank you very much.